right, welcome to this morning's panel discussion, where we are going to be going through the extremely exciting topic of how do we go from industry best practices to space traffic management rules. And while I know that may seem just a little too much to handle, it's really important because that is the plan. If you look at what was in the text of the now infamous Space Policy Directive 3, issued in 2018 by the Trump administration, that set the policy of the United States for space traffic management, it says in there, I have a quote here somewhere, the United will to develop US-led minimum safety standards and best practices to coordinate space traffic. US regulatory agencies should, as appropriate, adopt these standards and best practices in domestic regulatory frameworks and use them to inform and help shape international consensus, practices, and standards. So the US policy is to build a space traffic management regime on industry best practices and standards. And it's not just the United States. As we heard a couple years ago here at Amos, the European Union has adopted the same approach with their space traffic management joint communique that was released in early 2022, where they are going to be encouraging the development of industry best practices and standards, and then using those as the formation for space traffic management. So that's the plan. Question is, how do we get there? And the good news is that over the last several years to 10 years or so, there's been a lot of work on developing industry best practices and some national and international standards. The challenging bit is there's a lot of them. And there's different groups of actors and there are different topics being addressed. And while there is some overlap, they're not all uniform in consensus. So what we're going to talk about over the next hour with this panel of experts is what are some, how do we get through this? How do we get from what we have, which are all of these really good best practices, to the next step, which is moving towards this thing called space traffic management. We might actually talk about what that is and how we define it, and that could also be probably a whole other topic. So joining me to work through this issue, to my immediate left, we have Dan Oltrogi, who is here in his role as the founder and administrator of the Space Safety Coalition, which is a group of companies and organizations that have developed and published a couple of sets of industry best practices for space safety. Next to him, we have David Goldstein, principal engineer from SpaceX, who is very involved in keeping the largest constellation on orbit safe, and has also been involved in helping figure out how we're going to do a lot of these things involved with how new things on space, large constellations. Next to him, we have Mario Borowitz, who has recently joined the Office of Space Commerce, where she is going to be focusing on international coordination for space situation awareness, and previously to that was a professor at Georgia Tech, working on space policy issues. And finally, we have Jerome Barbier. I think I got that right? Close? Okay. Head of Outer Space, Digital and Economic Issues for the Paris Peace Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that has recently started working on space safety issues, and we'll have Jerome talk about that a little bit more as we get going on. As usual, please submit some questions into the webpage, and I will be working them in as we go through this. Goldie, I was hoping you could start us off by just giving us a snapshot of what it's like right now operating a large constellation in low Earth orbit. What are some of the challenges you are seeing daily, and are things getting easier or harder as time goes on?
It's just super easy doing this.
I have to say, you guys kind of make it look easy sometimes. I know I was a bit skeptical of the ability to manage that big of a constellation, but it looks easy sometimes.
It is definitely not easy. Lots of challenges every day. The thing that helps the most with ensuring that we're safe in space is transparency. Transparency is the number one thing. If I could say one thing today to everyone is be transparent in what you're doing. Sharing your ephemeris and covariance, having that screened, being open in coordination, being respectful that anything that we talk about in like bilateral discussions about space safety should be kept in that discussion. And we have to figure out ways to operate safely despite non-cooperative actors in space, because there are risks that we're experiencing that we have no control over, but that we have to figure out ways to overcome. And so, the best practices that we worked on with OneWeb and Iridium, I thought it was phenomenal that we could get three companies together and put together a set of aspirational best practices that we all looked at and said, there's some things in here that maybe we don't do today, but let's agree to a best practice set of documents that we can aspire to. And as we think through this, let's use that as the lens. The lens of a best practice is aspirational. So let's make that a ground rule for when we start to come together, so that we don't fall into the trap of falling to the lowest common denominator in whatever group we have of, well, everyone has to be able to meet these requirements, so let's make them very easy.
Mm-hmm. And I think that point you highlighted about, everyone needs to coordinate regardless if you're a commercial competitor or different countries, because we're all sharing the same space, and that is becoming ever more present, especially as more entities are launching their own constellations and there's interaction between those. Yeah. So Dan, I'm going to turn to you. You've helped coordinate the activities of the Space Safety Coalition, as I mentioned, which recently published an updated set of your recommended practices for orbital safety. How have things changed since that first set of SSC recommendations came out?
Quite a bit. So Amos 2019, we actually announced and published during the conference the first set of best practices. And that document is still unique today in adopting the UN treaties and guidelines, IADC guidelines, and ISO and CCSDS standards as its foundation, and then adding over 40 additional aspirational best practices. This document is also aspirational, as Goldie had mentioned, for their document. But things have changed a lot. We have seen a 5-fold increase in the number of conjunctions in the last 5 years alone. But there's also events like the Russian ASAT test and cybersecurity threats and security threats in general that didn't used to exist, were not that prevalent before. So these are driving the endorsees of the Space Safety Coalition Best Practices document, and it numbers about 70 space companies today, to want to enhance the document. And that drove actually the enhancements to be added for 12 specific enhancements to the document. One of them simply was all these UN and ISO and IADC documents are evolving. So we had to update the document just to stay current with those. But again, there's no intentional fragmentation in space. That was the number one thing that operators wanted to see in a best practices document. And then there's a whole host of other things, including cybersecurity, and importantly, rules of the road. There's been a lot of international call for rules of the road. And so we took a stab at trying to address that in this new document. And today, version 2, it's on spacesafety.org. We have 39 endorsees of that brand new document, and we welcome anyone to join and endorse.
No intentional fragmentations. That sounds like something everybody should be doing, but I'm not quite sure everyone's gotten the message on that.
It needs to be said.
Yes, I fully agree. So, Jerome, I'm going to turn to you now. You work for the Paris Peace Forum, which is a new actor getting into this discussion. Can you talk a little bit about what the Paris Peace Forum is, why you've gotten involved in this discussion of industry best practices and standards, and what it is you guys have been working on?
Yes, with pleasure. So yet another actor working on outer space governance. So as you recall, the Paris Peace Forum has a mandate to strengthen global governance, especially with a head of state level summit.
I think slow down.
That we have. I will be slower. That we have every year in November. So we really have a political mandate to bring also the private sector, experts and academics discussing with government entities when it comes to developing principles or norms of good behavior, of sustainable behavior, also in every field of governance, so also global health, the environment, cyber issues, or AI, especially when cutting-edge technologies are related. So why did we go in outer space? As we've seen quite a proliferation of initiatives when it comes to STM and STC in the last 5 years. We had some consultations with members of the industry across the value chain and beyond the industry with governments, but also what is very important was beyond the space sector, with the diplomatic community, with clients, also space infrastructure such as the tech companies. And there was 2 main shared observations across the globe from the US, from China, from Europe, and global South countries, which were that first, the true issue with space-traffic coordination is not that much to create a framework, but to clarify how existing provisions of international law apply to the new state-of-the-art of the space sector, to better articulate the very good frameworks that we have, industry best practices that were already proposed by different institutions, including the Space Safety Coalition, for instance. And finally, to work on implementation of existing norms, especially UN recommendations that were agreed by consensus by states. So this is where we were. And the second point was that we lacked for space-traffic coordination and for space generally about a clear consensus about the direction you need, the clear goals. What is sustainable space activities? What are the indicators? And can we agree on some things, as we did for the environment on Earth, for instance, with the 1.5-degree target? We will not reach it most likely, but still we have a direction. And for that, you actually need political awareness, and you need the involvement of the political actors. So this is actually why we launched the Net Zero Space Initiative, which is a political document supported so far by 70 actors from 25 nations around the globe that is just giving the political signal that there is a consensus among the space community, whether you are American, Chinese, whether you're a government entity, an industry player, or even a client of space infrastructure, that you need to work on those issues. So we are really much focusing on the political awareness dimension when it comes to STM and STC.
And in your engagement with those, with the political community, and the Paris Peace Forum has connection to heads of state level political actors. So we're talking very high level. What was their reaction to the space safety, standards, collisions?
Well, I think that it happens several times that when I was mentioning like space governance, they thought I was talking about urbanism. So physical space and not outer space, because it's not a political issue for many countries, actually. And this is actually also, I think, one key point in the equation. In the US, there is a level of political maturity around this issue where actually a significant amount of political players in the US are elected on outer space issues. There is a strong and long-standing policy on outer space domain, of course, due to the importance of the US actors in that field. It is not the case around the world, even in historic spacefaring nations where it's not really a political issue. So people understand the fact, but they either, at the heads of state level and their staff, they either send the issue back to the agency or technical expert, or just ignore the subject. So this is what we are trying to work on a bit more.
Mariel, Dan mentioned the work on this right-of-way, which is an important topic in this question, right? We're all used to driving well, not in Australia, but here in America, we drive on the right-hand side of the road, right? And we know sort of the right-of-way activities in airspace and maritime. You've done some work when you were at Georgia Tech on this issue of right-of-way of space. Can you talk about kind of how you approached that and what were some of the framing you thought about?
Sure, thanks, Brian. So in that previous research, we looked at the space environment, kind of created a simulation. We're able to look at different types of rules. I think, we looked at things like making rules based on the type of operator, based on the size of the spacecraft, and be some metric about the value of the spacecraft. Like, there's lots of different ways that you could make these rules. And there are differences in what you get out in terms of the simplicity, the equity, the efficiency of these different rules. I think there's still a lot more work and research to be done in that area. Other types of rules, people are interested in relative position, for example. So I think there's still a lot to look at. I think a couple of things strike me about it, both in doing that research and in moving to this new role. So one, I think there's always going to be pros and cons to each of these different rules. And I think you brought up the example of driving on the right side of the road. I mean, I think at some point we need to do this research. We need to understand the pros and cons. But at the end of the day, we'll need to just decide which side of the road are we gonna drive on? So I think we need to see that coming and not think that this is something we're just gonna get a technical answer to and then that'll be the obvious way forward, right? We want to be technically informed, but at some point we'll have to make a call. So I think there's that to keep in mind that's really important. And I think the other thing I've seen, both in the research when we were trying to actually build the model and look at these things, there's a lot of data missing. And just understanding exactly what's up there, exactly what the capabilities of different spacecraft are, what type of owner. I mean, even somewhat basic stuff can be hard to get access to. And so I think there's a lot of groundwork that we can lay, near-term concrete steps that we can do in international coordination, international cooperation, working with others just to get that information and to get the lines of communication open, right? The system we have now where you get the CDM, you hope there's contact information, you hope that when you call that number, someone's gonna answer, you hope that if they answer, they're gonna actually do something and have a conversation. That's not really a sustainable system. And so I think just dealing with those initial concrete steps is another thing we can be doing, in addition to this other, forward-looking research on the side.
Yeah, I think to pile on to that, as an owner-operator who checks space track to find the contact information, for all of those listening out here, if you have not registered your satellite on space track and put your contact information and check the box to make sure that your information is not private so that it's shared with others, and if you're thinking about a spacecraft, put propulsion on it. Give yourself the ability to be able to do it. I would love to be able to ensure that we have to have ground rules because everybody has the capability to be able to maneuver to avoid conjunctions.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that when we start talking about sort of how, what should be in these, rules. I'm going to put that in quote for the time being when we get to that. Meryl, to your point about, how do we technically informed, about 10 or 15 years ago, I was reading a paper written by a lawyer who took the maritime traffic rules and crossed out maritime, put space in front of them. And so his space traffic rules were along the lines of, all spacecraft should approach each other in a reasonable velocity and at a speed so it can be visible to both parties, and those, and we all
but not
laugh.
too bright, right?
and we all laugh because this community understands that velocity is not always a variable when you are dealing with orbital mechanics, or at least if you want to be in that same orbit. But to your point that having that technical understanding is a bit challenging for people because it's different in space than it is in some of these other domains. And we'll come back. I think we'll come back to this a little bit later. But it is not so simple to say, two satellites, pass on the right or that sort of a thing. It's just it's not that easy to come up with that. So Dan, I want to turn to you. You've had various roles in the U.S. delegation to the International Organization for Standards, also as the ISO liaison to the United Nations. You've been looking across, I think we talked about more than a dozen of these different groups of best practices and proposals. Are there some common elements there? Are the differences too big to bridge? How would you think we start coalescing towards something we can kind of agree on?
Yeah, so actually there is quite a bit of synergy going on. It's not necessarily something you see, but behind the scenes it's happening. And I want to tie this back to the previous discussion with the plea for points of contact and realistic covariance in that. In the standards world, we are trying to make sure that message types in CCSDS and ISO include contacts, contact points of contact information for the technical person and the management person and the organization and flight dynamics. So we're trying to address those things, have ways to share covariance and low thrust maneuvers and such in a realistic way. But overall, after the Space Safety Coalition published their first document in 2019, as Brian said, roughly there's been 2 new best practices a year released. And it reminds me of recurring papers on optimal constellations. And like, wait a minute, we just had an optimal constellation. They're serving sort of different, sometimes serving different scope, different audience. I really like the best practices that Goldie and company put together. That had a very nice operational flavor. The Space Safety Coalition is kind of, well, it has insurers and spacecraft manufacturers and SSA companies and a lot of different entities participated in that. We've had some others that are more, maybe only 3 pages long, that have really a space policy and legal flavoring. So those aren't necessarily not harmonized with each other. They are, in fact, fairly harmonized. They're just speaking to different audiences in a number of aspects. But there have been, in the standards world, a lot of new standards going on. There's a large constellation standard in development. There is on-orbit conjunction assessment, which used to be a technical report. That's becoming a standard now. Launch collision avoidance is a brand new standard we're developing. Space traffic coordination is a standard that's gotten high technical and political interest, let's say. So we're working through that. And then the ever-present, efforts to mitigate space debris, and also a new launch data message standard that I just got approved for us to work on. So all these things are happening, and then meanwhile, you've got the regulatory framework. Finally, circling back to your question, nobody likes to reinvent the wheel. And
I'll say, there are some engineers I know who love reinventing it all the time, but
okay, I don't like to reinvent the wheel. And I'm happy to see that content is being incorporated both, upwards and downwards with industry best practices and standards, and at the UN level, IDC, and national regulatory. I'm seeing this, bidirectional flow of content. And some content maybe was ill-advised to begin with, and you don't see it adopted. Other content is like, yeah, that really makes sense, and it's being incorporated in other documents. And to me, that's kind of probably the long term. It'll take a while for the dust to settle. But when a lot of people incorporate the same content, that's a pretty good validation of it.
And can you just talk for a second about the countries and the entities involved in this standards process, right? It's not just the United States. Who's involved?
Absolutely. So there are some standards groups that are more domestic, et cetera, but I'm really focused on the truly international community with 147 countries helping to develop these standards. On the ISO side, there's a lot of members there. On the CCSDS side, that is an agency-funded thing. So there's 11 space agencies in the world that fund that. And you might say, well, that's not everybody. No, it isn't. It tends to be the more spacefaring countries. But actually, the beauty of that model, which is looking to standardize the sharing of data, is because it's funded, it's fully funded by the space agencies, they're not going to nickel and dime you on a standard. It's freely available to the world.
Which I appreciate.
Yes.
Great. Jerome, I want to go back to you from your perspective in Europe. Where do you see international coordination going on this topic? So I mentioned, the U.S. was sort of a first mover in putting on SPD3, which was a very national-focused document. It essentially said, we're going to figure out our national framework, and then we'll do some international coordination. My interpretation of the joint communique from the European Union was more of a, we're going to do both at the same time sort of a question. So where do you see this international coordination piece going? Because it's going to be an important element of this.
It's going to be important, but there are challenges indeed. So yes, the difference between the EU and the US so far is that we are having both conversations at the same time. And I think it's found, because if you come at the table with a national policy already enshrined, it's extremely difficult to negotiate because your counterpart knows that you can't move from your position. So especially when you're the dominant actor, if we quote the US at this stage, it's important also to leave room to discussions with different actors. There is also an issue, the STC debate will be multi-layered. So there is industry good practices, there is question of velocity. You were giving the example of the declaration of the lawyer which made this recommendation. You won't have an initial agreement, whether binding or non-binding, a clear pace or velocity. You will have a reasonable amount of velocity, and this is actually what should be there. It's not the role of a treaty or initial agreement to detail technical things, because it will not be able to keep the pace with the evolution of technology. If you have, just the LTS guideline for the most technical parts of it, it took 10 years to negotiate. I'm not sure that you want to have like technical conditions enshrined in the UN framework, whether binding or not binding. So this is how it's going. How I see the things going on, so far it's going to be fragmented. When we have this debate, it's, I think, important to recall that STC, which is the coordination issue at the international level, is a question. And so how are we going to do that? Our position at the Paris Peace Forum is to say that the most likely outcome would be to have a coordination of the main specific nation, to just agree on simple principles and rules of the world. And when I say that, I just don't say US and Europe, but also US, Europe, India, China, and Japan, for instance, on this end. But, sorry, I forgot about my first idea in the first place.
It's okay. So do you, what I have heard is this tension between the national, each country figuring out for themselves versus the international consensus. Do you see that same tension, and do we have to do one first, or is this strategy of both at the same time probably the way we're going to go?
Thank you, because I found that initial idea. So I think it should go both ways, because STC at the national level is something that needs to be negotiated. But STM is not just only a national and domestic issue, it's actually a professional national law. States are competent for their own space traffic management. And you have a framework in the US, there is a framework in France, which is very comprehensive and by law. The question is, will those national frameworks go in the same direction? Or will we have conflicting requirements and different rules of the road? So I think this is why you need to have both conversations at the same time, saying, okay, we are still working on that at the domestic level, but here are our main ideas, and seeing what your counterparts abroad, especially with non-like-minded countries, we think.
And frankly, this is how things happened a little bit in the air domain, right? You had conflicting national regimes, primarily US and UK, and that in part helped lead to the Chicago Convention and the international discussion on that. Dan, I wanted to come back to you really quickly. He just used a couple different terms, space traffic coordination, space traffic management. I know you've been deep in the discussions on those distinctions. Can you clarify that for the audience on sort of what that discussion is and what those mean?
Yeah, great. When SPD3 came out, I would personally assert that the acronym we used in that document was incorrect. And I think we all recognize that now as space traffic management. And if you look at what the 18th has done with their excellent services over the years and dedication to spaceflight safety, it has been a coordination role. So STC, space traffic coordination, is really the language that I think addresses what has been done in the past. When I proposed a space traffic management standard within ISO, that didn't pass. It was close to passing, but it didn't. And one of the main issues with it was the word management and requirements for how you manage or regulate space traffic. That is seen as an issue of national sovereignty. And this is pretty clear now in the international community. Space traffic management, although we continue to use that, even for the DOC discussions and the House appropriations language, we still say space traffic management. I think it's an outgrowth of this, of SPD3 language. We need to try and standardize our terminology so that internationally we can have a good, constructive dialogue.
So then, coordination would be sort of the things we're doing now to talk to different people and bypass things, but management then is that added national regulatory level of kind of where we're maybe going in the future.
Yes, that's how most countries see it. And I do think someday there'll be an opportunity to standardize the regulations too, the STM. We can perhaps standardize it, but as you said, you have to kind of let the nations do their interpretation, and then you can look across them and see the commonalities and then drive that to maybe consensus.
Mariel, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just add on to that, what Dan was mentioning. I mean, I agree. I think the terminology is sometimes used interchangeably, but I do think there is a recognition at the Department of Commerce and elsewhere that what we're trying to do now is space traffic coordination, right? We want that communication, we want that coordination. That's where we are with the best practices with industry partners, but also internationally. So I think there is that recognition, but also that important tie between the two concepts, right? That perhaps someday you do move to that space traffic management, right? But I agree, everything we're doing today, the things in the near term, it's all the space traffic coordination effort.
Just a reminder to the audience, I've got a few more questions to kind of set the stage here. Please submit some from your end. There's already a few in the queue, but we're going to be rapidly approaching that part of things. Goldie, I want to go back to you as the biggest satellite operator in the world. How do you see the path forward on this and this discussion between sort of what we're currently doing as coordination and getting towards a future space traffic management? Are these voluntary guidelines and practices the way to go? Or do you think there's something more standardized, potentially mandatory we need to work towards?
So there's always a balance, right? No one wants to have rules thrust upon them that they don't like, right? If you agree with the rule,
or weren't involved in putting together, right? Yeah.
Right. Well, either way, you may, if you got a vote, you may be able to accept it, even if your vote was no. But to me, I think we need the sort of bottoms up and the top down approach. Owner operators, in my opinion, have a lot of power to adopt best practices and work well together and set the example. And I hate to say this, but shame those who don't, right? If you're shame is a great motivator. It's not great to use all the time, but we need to continue to set the example and do the right thing. And we wrote the best practices document with 2 other constellations. We would love for any other constellation or any other satellite operator to join with us to say, hey, we'll sign up to do those. And oh, by the way, here's a couple things that we think would make this a better document. We would love to hear that. We would adopt it. From the bottom up, but we also need the top down. We need everybody working on adopting and following best practices. And I was sitting here thinking, we really need a best practices for launch providers, like a separate section just for that. A best practice for DoD or MOD and IC and intelligence community, because they don't want people to know where they are, but everybody really knows where they are anyway. And
as we talked about yesterday,
yeah, exactly,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. And then us, space traffic coordinators' best practices. Maybe we should write one, what owner operators wish the space traffic coordinators' best practices were, right? We could write it for them, and then maybe they could do it. I don't know. But having the top down and bottom up, but then moving towards some kind of standards where best practices, I think, are aspirational. The standards and regulations have to be the minimum bar. Mm-hmm. And so they can't go straight across to each other. The best practices are, we're going to do our best to hit the objective, but there's a minimum threshold that everybody has to follow. Like every owner operator should have to submit their ephemeris and covariance and screening. I'm going to say it every time I start talking. Everyone needs to do that. This should be a rule, in my opinion.
And not just your ephemeris, but your ephemeris that it includes upcoming maneuvers. Right?
Correct. yes, absolutely. And let me to Dan's point, accurate ephemeris with reasonable covariance, right? We want both of those things.
I'm sure we could have a whole discussion about what those two adjectives
Just
mean.
ask Matt Hayduke, he'll tell you all about it.
Dan?
Actually, I want to, add to that. There is a perception in some government circles that, okay, here's the commercial practices. And as you started out the talk, you said the U.S. wants to take these and run with them. There is a huge difference between the set of aspirational best practices, with 40 aspirational goals in the SSC document and 15 nations participating. There's a huge difference between operators' willingness to aspirationally do better versus this minimum set, as Goldie said, and they're not the same. And there may be some of those that make perfect sense to bring over, like sharing of ephemeris with maneuvers, or even operator observations. That may be something that can be moved over to the regulatory side, but we're still going to need this aspirational side to stir people to do better. I like how the large constellations, we're talking about a 5-year maximum post-mission lifetime, and they're doing far better than that. So we need to respect that difference.
We actually aspired to 1 year.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to add, so I agree. I think that approach of knowing that at aspirational goals, right, and where you want to go, but also knowing, well, what's the minimum? What do we need to be achieving right now? I think that is a really important construct to have in mind. I think the other thing that's really important in this industry is that we do have pretty good communication, I think, and with the Department of Commerce, there's a lot of awareness that, we're not just running off with a blank page, talking to other countries working on this issue, right? We have the written best practice and things, but we also have a relationship with industry, right? And an intention to have those discussions as an ongoing effort, right? So it's not just running off without kind of thinking through what is the minimum, what is aspirational, making sure we really understand those differences.
Yeah.
One other thing, though, the elephant in the room to me is there are nations out there that are not interested, it doesn't seem, in following them. I don't know if they are or not, or if they just don't know about them. But this
or
has to be
incommunicado on this issue.
right. The whole solar system has to adopt these, right? It can't just be the West or the willing. It has to be everybody.
Yeah, no, and that is a challenging problem, right? Because and I use the term incommunicado because, to be honest, so my organization has done some interactions with other countries on this issue and tried to breach some of that, and we've had some success, but in some cases there's just no answer. And the question is it because they're still working on figuring out what they want to do, or whatever else? It's a real challenge.
Yeah, I want to kind of highlight one of the papers that we presented in June in Japan on threats from unannounced spacecraft. And we took, just as an example, Luch, but there's others, we took that and we looked at the maneuvers that we teased out of our ComSpock high accuracy solutions. And then we said, okay, what additional delta V, not just magnitude, but direction, would be required on top of this maneuver to cause a collision? And in one case, it was like 5%. So think about that. This really is something that needs to be addressed and isn't yet.
So
One other thing on that. So, you said we make it look very easy. In thinking about it, it looks easy because there's a lot of people and organizations behind the scenes that do a lot of work. The 18th and 19th, slave day and night to make sure that we are all getting good information. Companies like Leo Labs that we work with provide CDMs. We obviously work very hard, but to Dan's point, that there are risks that are there that are not being addressed today that could be. And one of the large risks is the time between your satellite deploys and when they are first screened for conjunctions. And when owner operators are assessing when they're going to launch and where they're going to launch to, they really need to be thinking about how long that time is going to be. Because if you're launching with a bunch of other CubeSats, there's going to be 10 or 20. It's going to take them a week or two. And we had recently in June a couple of launches, 40 satellites each, that came right into Starlink shells, and those weren't cataloged for 9 or 10 days. And we get it, that's difficult to do, but those are some technical problems that can be solved today, I think. They can be solved. And so we need to address those without getting the cooperation. We need to figure out technological solutions to address some of these risks.
So picking up on that theme, Meryl, I'm going to turn back to you. Including that, are there other topics or areas of risk where you think we need to kind of focus our discussion on some of the problems that still need tackling, right? Because we have some existing practices we've talked about where there are some issues we think we've got a pretty good handle on how to do, but are there additional ones we need to really put some brain power into?
Yeah, I would say, one of the things when I think about space traffic coordination and what's needed there, there are a number of different ways to attack it. I think one is thinking about, what are the really high risk areas, right? So we don't have to, different areas of space are different. And I think it is important to have that flexibility and have that nuance when you're thinking about coordination, thinking about rules. So one is to focus on, where do we have the most danger? Where do we have the most congestion? What might be the near-term priorities there? I think thinking about low-hanging fruit, right? What are the things near-term that we could, if we can get it implemented, if we can get agreement on, we can implement tomorrow or the next day, right? Things related to communication, for example. And then I think the other thing is to look forward, right? And I think we have the tools and we have the awareness of new large constellations that are potentially going up from different countries in different locations. And we have an idea what might be coming in the future. And I think we need to start working on those issues now and not wait until things are actually up there in space and we're having these conjunctions to start to try to solve that. So I think it's, all three of those, the high risk, the low hanging fruit, and the forward-looking issues.
So turning to some of the audience questions now, there's one here that relates to something we talked about, but I want to make sure we put a little bit finer point on it, and that's that common practices are not always best practices or the things we should be doing. So are there any common practices you see that's going on now that you think probably are not great to be kind of formalized as a rule going forward?
Oh, you're looking at me. Yes, there are, and I would say, for example, the practice of thresholds and metrics used to define the severity of a close approach. We presented 2 years ago. We did a survey with the SDA and presented the results here at Amos, and there is sort of consensus in the LEO regime, but sort of not, in terms of what constitutes a serious conjunction. But then, what do you target when you do decide to move? How much lower are you trying to make that? There are people that use miss distance, collision probability, radial separation, different metrics. And then when you go to geo, it's just that much more. We're all over the map there on what's used for thresholds and metrics. So it'd be nice to try and address and standardize those things, but there's a hidden thing that we concluded out of that paper 2 years ago, is that those metrics and thresholds are driven by that operator's particular hardware, their orbit regime, their customer set, the criticality of their mission, how long it takes to replace something. They're not necessarily driven by environmental, sustainability and safety. So in a way, we're kind of missing that extra layer of minimum, requirement that should be overlaid on this. And then how one does orbit determination through maneuvers. The astrodynamics and techniques really do matter. Rocket science is important. And some of the techniques physically are unable to fit through past maneuvers, and so that's something that our paper actually in an hour and a half here will talk about maneuvers themselves and just how much they degrade SSA, and the techniques used, astrodynamics used, really is an element of that.
And just
Right.
to pick up on Dan real quickly, so is it a matter that we have not yet settled on what should be the standard for assessing conjunctions, or is it that we should not have one standard because there's many different ways to look at it?
I think we're not seeing the willingness to try multiple techniques and figure out which one works best.
Okay. Gotcha.
So a couple of the sort of common practices, and Dan mentioned this, but it kind of slid by, and I want to make sure that that I emphasize this. Sharing ephemeris and covariance is great. It would be the next level if people would share their observations, because if they would share the observations, those could be fused together to form better solutions. And so that would be one where I would say a common practice of just sharing ephemeris. Ooh, let's go to the next level and share observations as well. Another one would be launch collision avoidance. The common practice is you propagate out 3 hours past launch. But then there's this gap between when that 3 hours ends and when a satellite gets cataloged and is screened, and that gap needs to be addressed. So 3 hours, the common practice, it's not enough. Now this is tough because the dispersions on the rocket are big, right? Those are big. So we got to figure out ways to address that launch cola gap.
I remember about 10 years ago when the UN and COPIUS was still talking about long-term sustainability, and I was part of one of the expert groups looking at the space operations. The launch cola came up, and at the time there were several countries that said we should not create a best practice for that because we don't know what the best practice is. So is that still the case with launch cola?
No,
Okay.
it isn't. But there's a parallel to that activity you're mentioning, which is that in ISO in 2005, Japan suggested, the delegation suggested a launch cola standard, and they wanted to use missed distance as the single criterion. And I ended up, participating in that development, and we added collision probability to the mix because that actually frees up your window while recognizing that launchers have huge dispersions, and as you get further and further away, collision probability drops. You just don't have a good enough data. Okay. That was voted. It's not that it was voted down, it wasn't voted up because too many people abstained because they didn't have that experience. That standard is now in development today because countries do have enough expertise. And I do want to foot-stomp something Goldie said, because as I mentioned earlier, a launch data message has now been approved. If you think of the SpaceX launches of 142 or something, Transporter 2, all these deployed satellites and all the operators and so forth, that's an opportunity for us to make a standard. My vision is that it's machine-to-machine readable. You can ingest it into your system. The 18th and 19th, for example, that they have their radar screens. You can map that scenario directly into what their radar screens should look like, so they can identify things much quicker. That's kind of my vision there.
So one of the things that we're doing to address the launch cola is we're taking the known deployment state. So once the deployment occurs, we take that state and now we can propagate that state and screen it. And so that's a way of extending the launch screening in a more accurate way. On Transporter 9, we're working with two companies, Cayenne Space and Slingshot Aerospace. They're going to be working with our customers that are launching to generate ephemeris and covariance and have it screened. Because if, again, back to if satellite owner operators will screen their ephemeris, the 18th can use that ephemeris to help associate the observations from the radar. So they can speed up the cataloging, so you get 2 for 1. You get a collision avoidance screening if you're screening the FM, and you get a faster cataloging of the objects.
Gotcha. Meryl, there's a question here. Look at the role of the off-space commerce in enacting and or enforcing rules of the road. I know you guys are still trying to get the basic mission, the coordination mission today underway, but have you started thinking about what the office might be, how approaching this issue of rules of the road going in the future?
Yeah, so for now, and thanks for the question, the Office of Space Commerce doesn't have any authority to put in place space traffic management or put in
And by the
place
way,
rules.
I just want
right?
to emphasize that Congress has not yet given Commerce the authority to do any of the space traffic management stuff. That is still a TBD.
Right. So we don't really focus on rules or how we put in place rules. I think we're really squarely focused on the space traffic coordination piece, right, and the space situational awareness piece. So, we are building out tracks. We are looking at what international entities are doing. We're talking to international partners. We're talking to other nations to try to make sure there's coordination in those efforts. We're reading these best practice documents, right? Making sure we're having these discussions. So that's part of the international dialogue as well. But for now, it's very much on that communication and coordination level for us.
I'm going to, Jerome, I want to ask you a question here. There's a question about going beyond the physical conjunctions about radio frequency interference, and I want to add in the light pollution, dark and quiet skies that the keynote mentioned. Is that something, Jerome, you guys are looking at through your effort with the Paris Peace Forum? And can you talk a little bit about some of the discussions happening on coordinating best practices for those topics?
So we're not really engaged on the spectrum issue. We know that the ITU model is quite welcomed by many actors of the industry also to just deal with the common pool resource. We had discussion though with the around the notion of carrying capacity and what it actually does means, what are the variables that could be at stake, also to maybe give some indicators about when it's not sustainable to operate in the orbital environment compared to the state of the art of both the number of massive objects, but also beyond that, technology advancement, automation, available SAC data, also to coordinate things, but not really other ways on that. But just maybe shortly to build on what was just said by Marielle on that. I think it's very interesting that you said that Commerce is doing space traffic coordination, because I understand the point of view. You're coordinating the efforts of the industry and different actors. I think it's important on the international side to think of the unwanted effect of this sort of wording, because from abroad, you're doing space traffic management. I mean, law management is still management, and from an international perspective, the US government bears the ultimate responsibility for every actor's activities, and should something happen badly with the foreign actors, I mean, sorry for you, but you're the one who is going to negotiate the settlement. And I think it's this sort of slight, unconscious thing in wording are actually framing a lot of the behavior of non-like-minded states that might fear the US reaction, precisely because there is a strong focus on the domestic debate. And so it's important to keep in mind that there are other actors and that indeed there is a domestic debate. And nationally, it's about coordinating the efforts of the industry, coordinating the best practices to see what could a framework could actually happen. And I know you have a decentralized approach because DoD will keep the authority for military activities. But once again, from an international perspective, it's still the US government.
Mm-hmm. So I would just add, so I think one thing is also the distinction between authority and responsibility, right? So I think there is responsibility for the US government for, authorizing, supervising activity, right? That's part of the Outer Space Treaty. So I think there is a recognition of that responsibility and that the importance of that role, but authority in terms of the ability to make rules, I think, is the distinction. But absolutely.
So I was joking earlier about some previous attempts to pull from other domains, maritime to space traffic. More seriously, anyone have thoughts on, are there things that were done right in other traffic domains that you think we should look at for space traffic coordination, space traffic management? Air, maritime, other things. Jerome, you want to start?
I think the maritime domain is a very good example when it comes to developing space traffic management rules for outer space for different reasons. First, most of the framework when it comes to maritime traffic management is made through customary practices. So it's basically relying and ensuring in international law the state of the art of industry best practices. And second, it's a good field where states manage to actually get clarification about the main principles, about the rules of the roads, about agreement that were both when it comes to the traffic per se, but also signals that they could send and channel of communication for that. So I think it's the most, I know there is a lot of comparison with aviation sector. I don't think it's quite relevant when it comes to the outer space domain. First, because most of the space capacities that should be regulated or at least coordinated for the traffic do not involve human lives. Mm-hmm. So far, and also because it was a very different state of the art, politically speaking, also when it comes to like the political momentum you had in 1944 after the Second World War, which is not existing nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have anything you want to?
I'll just say, looking at air traffic control, think how different that would be if when airplanes collided or exploded, that debris stayed right there above the earth in that spot, and you have to fly around it. There are useful constructs you can pull from air traffic and maritime, but we need to be careful about the huge differences sometimes. In maritime law, where it says that the maneuvering vessel needs to make a big enough maneuver so that it can be seen by the other guy, and they know that there's going to be a safe passage. That isn't possible in space. We just have such a huge lag time, and the tiny maneuvers that Goldie conducts, for example, to avoid a threat, you can't be observed sometimes for a while by the other guy unless there's the huge transparency that we need.
Ariel?
Yeah, I would just say, I think a lot of times, the actual words of those rules, right, there's too many differences in the way the domains work, but conceptually, the idea behind those rules, and so I think, Dan, the one you just mentioned is a good one where, the idea is you want the other party to know that you're choosing to undergo a maneuver, right? And I think that concept definitely does translate, even if the kind of technical way of going about that is very different.
Because the only thing worse than nobody maneuvering, it might be both people doing a maneuver, right? Goldie, there's a question here about the sort of looks to the future, and I want to frame it as, you guys are currently managing, I think, somewhere around 5,600 active satellites, but you've got plans to go to tens of thousands. Is what we're doing now going to scale for that, especially when you guys are not the only constellation with tens of thousands?
So we fortunately thought about the future in architecting the system. And so we have designed an incredibly agile and capable collision avoidance system that can, it accommodated the Russian ASAT in stride. We've probably done over 5,000 maneuvers just for the debris from that collision. Wow. And so from the capability of our system internally, yes, we're going to be able to accommodate and station keep tighter so that we can interleave these satellites all together. There needs to be investment in SSA and in transparency so that it will scale. If every satellite owner operator in space shared their observations and their maneuver plans, yes, it could be done. If all nations and launch providers would stop leaving derelict rocket bodies up in space, these things will all contribute. If we all implement a zero debris sort of approach to going forward, yes. If we keep going exactly the way we're going right now, it's going to make it difficult.
So I have to ask, is your autonomous collision avoid system open source at all? Because you guys have put a lot of time and effort into that. I am not sure that I can count on every other constellation operator will be able to do that, even if they're willing to do so. So
we, I'm going to say this real quick, tongue in cheek, but I learned a new word here at Amos this week. It's called, the word is interlude. And if you know where that came from, you can laugh. If you don't, look in your gift bag because you'll find it in there. It's to inadvertently convey messaging other than intended with a high PM, a high probability of misperception. If you do something, it could be misperceived. Okay. If you're not sharing your ephemeris and being transparent, then the way I personally perceive that is you're hiding something. You're either hiding a capability, maybe your covariance is terrible and you don't want to share it because you don't want other people to know about it. That's what I intuit when people don't share their ephemeris, is there's something wrong with it, and that makes me worried. Share it. We share all of our ephemeris in several ways publicly. Anybody with a space track account can go out there and get our ephemeris. And you can look at it, and we've gotten feedback for how our ephemeris is, and we've made changes because we shared it. Being transparent to me is the number one thing that everybody needs to do. If we would all do that, we'll get there. We will, if anybody wants to learn about our autonomous collision avoidance system, we'll tell you.
Okay. All right. We're going to end there for this morning. Please join me in thanking my panelists.